The window of a luxury car becomes the most honest mirror when a young woman believes no one is watching. Miss Wen, desperate to sabotage her arranged date, transforms her appearance from stunning heiress to deliberately unattractive stranger, all while CEO Mr. G observes every calculated move from his vehicle, completely captivated by her authentic self. In a world where 78% of marriages in certain elite circles are still arranged for business advantages, Miss Wen's rebellion against a system that treats her as currency becomes more than just a personal choice. It becomes a statement. Her martial arts training prepared her for physical battles, but nothing prepared her for the emotional warfare of falling for someone she was determined to reject. What she doesn't realize is that her attempt to appear ordinary has made her extraordinary in his eyes. Will she uncover his silent admiration, or will her defiance lead her down a path she never expected? If you're hooked on this tale of rebellion and romance, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Miss Wen sat quietly at the head of the long, gleaming oak table, her slender fingers resting on the crystal stem of a wine glass she didn't intend to drink from. She watched as the guests filtered in, each step measured, each greeting carefully practiced. The sprawling Key mansion, bathed in the warm light of chandeliers large enough to fill entire rooms, exuded the kind of wealth that clung to the air like expensive cologne. Golden curtains framed windows as tall as two-story buildings, and polished marble floors reflected the lavish floral arrangements and the glitter of jewelry. Everything about the setting screamed perfection. Yet to her, it was a prison dressed in silks and gemstones. The weight of expectation pressed down harder with every moment she spent in the grand dining hall. In the center of the sea of guests stood Chung Yu, her fiancé-to-be, his posture confident, but his appearance forgettable. Miss Wen had always described him with the cutting precision she reserved for annoyances. Second-rate, she had once called him, as if he were little more than a subpar merchant's display. His laugh carried across the room, full of artificial charm meant to flatter the elders, mingling around him. But to her, it only added to the chorus of reasons why she couldn't go through with this night. This was not the life she wanted, and no gilded invitations or perfunctory smiles could convince her otherwise. The engagement was a business arrangement, a merger of two prominent families, a seamless tie that would maintain their prestige. For her parents, this was a badge of honor, a crown jewel of social triumph. For Miss Wen, it was nothing short of suffocation. As the room hummed with polite conversation, another figure lingered near the entrance to the hall. Butler Wang, a man who prided himself on knowing the inner workings of both the Key mansion and the minds of its inhabitants, kept a careful eye on her. Dressed impeccably in a tailored black suit, he blended into his surroundings, but never quite disappeared. Miss Wen was all too aware of his sharp, hawk-like gaze. He had spent years ensuring she never broke the well-defined mold expected of her, but tonight, that would change. She had spent weeks planning this. Beneath the floor-length gown, tailored meticulously to her measurements, she wore black pants and a simple blouse, garments much better suited for mobility. Tucked into the folds of the corset-like bodice of the dress was a small packet with cash and a forged ID, tools for her escape. Outside, hidden beneath the grand staircase that led into the mansion's main wing, her shoes waited, ready to carry her far from this ornate trap. Tonight, she would shatter her gilded cage. Miss Wen had always been one to keep her abilities unassuming. She performed traditional dances to please the family, her movements elegant, graceful. But the discipline and control honed through years of these performances were merely a mask over something much more practical. Martial arts had never been intended for her, of course. Her training had been born from rebellion, stolen hours practicing moves at a private dojo that her parents never approved of. Those skills were the sharp edge she now counted on, as much as the cash stuffed into her makeshift escape bag. The moment her parents stood to deliver their glad tidings to the room, she acted. The carefully orchestrated speeches were to signal the formal announcement of her engagement, but for Miss Wen, it was a countdown. In the last seconds before her name spilled from her father's lips like a binding chain, she slipped from her chair and through one of the small side entrances, covered by thick velvet drapes. Her movements were quick, yet composed, like a quiet storm that left only ripples in its wake. It didn't take long for Butler Wang to notice. He motioned toward the other household staff with a subtle, commanding gesture that sent them scrambling after her. But Miss Wen's timing had been flawless. By the time they reached the side entrance, she was already slipping across the sprawling back gardens of the Key estate. The trained heels she had worn moments earlier were discarded, and she moved now with practiced efficiency, her steps landing softly on the grass. Her martial arts training and the discipline it required guided her breath, light and steady. A sharp movement caught her eye, and she turned to see Butler Wang standing at the edge of the garden. He had caught up with her faster than expected. His commanding voice broke through the crisp evening air as he called out to her, insisting she return. Miss Wen didn't pause. What he lacked in physical agility, he attempted to compensate for with his relentless determination, but it was a pursuit that would ultimately falter. She darted through the intricately arranged garden paths, her dark clothes blending into the growing shadows. The chase unfolded, drawing upon both tension and a certain unspoken hilarity. Butler Wang, formidable in the domestic sphere, was far less capable when it came to physical exertion. His shouts grew louder, tinged with frustration, as she gained distance. Her escape wasn't just physical, but symbolic. It contradicted everything she had been raised to believe. When she finally reached the back fence, braced her hands against the cold wrought iron, and propelled herself over it with a fluid motion, she found herself staring out onto the dimly lit streets of the city beyond. She didn't stop to look back. From this moment onward, every decision would be hers to make, and hers alone. Unbeknownst to her, a set of eyes had been following her retreat this entire time. Parked beneath one of the smaller spans of trees bordering the Key estate was a sleek black car. Its driver, Ji Lee, commonly referred to as Mr. G, watched the scene unfold with a curious mixture of amusement and intrigue. Though technically connected to the Key family through his business dealings, he had avoided setting foot in the mansion that evening, opting instead to wait in his car, withdrawn from the pageantry of it all. Miss Wen's brisk dash for freedom had caught his attention the moment she crossed the gardens. He had recognized her, of course, but what intrigued him was not simply her identity. He had met plenty of carefully polished women like her in his various engagements, but the rawness of her rebellion. While the grand party inside celebrated conformity, outside, this woman epitomized defiance. Mr. G leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. A distant smirk played across his face, though it remained faint, as though even amusement was rationed carefully in his life. He knew he shouldn't involve himself. After all, whatever bold exit Miss Wen was executing had little to do with him. And yet he couldn't shake a subtle fixation with the way she had stripped herself of the constraints of their social order in a single night. It was easy for him, sitting in his tailored suit and pristine car, to dismiss the world of strict obligations he navigated daily. For him, the idea of Miss Wen fleeing her engagement wasn't shocking, it was refreshing. What would come of this act? Would she be caught and dragged back into the very life she had stolen away from? Or would this one courageous leap set her on a course she could never have followed if she had stayed? Mr. G slouched casually in the back seat of his sleek black car, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the leather armrest. The dim light in the car reflected off the finely tailored lapels of his suit, but his expression held none of the precision that his attire implied. As the chase unfolded before him, the poised yet clearly desperate Miss Wen, escaping the Key mansion's suffocating grandeur, there was a flicker of relief, almost satisfaction, in his eyes. The engagement was businesslike, a standard transaction in their circles, where emotion rarely played a role in the grandeur of formalities. For Mr. G, this broken engagement wasn't a loss, it was a reprieve. Tying himself to another prestigious family might shore up his public image, but the idea weighed on him like an iron chain. The thought of marrying into any arrangement, fueled solely by expectation, made him bristle. He had enough of those in his life. Watching from the comfort of his car, he noticed the precision in Miss Wen's movements, the elegance, stripped of its ornamental function, fully transformed into something utilitarian. It was rebellion, plain as day, and Ji Lee understood it more than he would dare admit. To the public, Ji Li's face was the kind that graced magazine covers. Chiseled, inscrutable, the perfect mixture of power and indifference. However, his reputation was not one of a golden sun. The tabloids weren't kind, painting him as aloof and calculating. A man with a bad reputation. Boardroom whispers suggested he was quick to cut old allies loose if a deal soured. His personal life didn't fare much better. A string of flings, embellished and exaggerated, contributed to an image that he didn't care enough to contest. This bad reputation wasn't entirely deserved, but he didn't waste time correcting misunderstandings. That was the irony of it. He kept his personal affairs far from the public eye, focused on efficiency, dispassionately managing companies and contacts with unwavering precision. Yet it was isolation as much as it was power, and it offered no protection against the vultures circling at his rare missteps. A 2023 study reported that over 60% of the public viewed CEOs as motivated by self-interest above all else, a sentiment that clung to Ji Li, despite his private indifference to wealth for wealth's sake. What confused his peers, of course, was his complete disinterest in traditional elite stepping stones, like arranged marriage. The Key family might be seething from this engagement collapse, but Ji Li couldn't summon a shred of pity or concern. To him, the formalities of their world felt increasingly hollow with every passing year. Miss Wen's escape not just from this particular trapping but from all it represented, was the sort of defiance he hadn't realized he needed to witness. While he had chosen quiet rebellion by sidestepping expectations, she was running openly, brazenly. For the first time that night he smiled. Not one of the careful half-smirks calibrated for his business associates, but something unguarded and real. His closest confidants didn't know this side of him, though they certainly had opinions about his choices, or lack of them, in the romance department. At an exclusive bar the week prior, his oldest friend Chung Zong leaned across the table, his tone ripe with condescension cloaked in concern. "Gee, you know it's not just about how you run things. People need to believe in you. Marrying someone ordinary, someone relatable, could do more for your image than 100 charity galas." Ji's response at the time had been measured. Familial obligation, reputational polishing. It was all so predictable. The idea of selecting a wife to shift the public narrative seemed absurd. He had smiled politely, then steered the conversation back toward nostalgia, a story about their university days. But after Chung's comment, the seed had been planted. Even now, sitting in the car parked near the Key Mansion's boundary, those words looped in his mind. Someone ordinary, someone real. But ordinary wasn't exactly what Ji wanted either. The truth was more complicated. What gnawed at him wasn't an absence of options, but the inability to find anyone who could look past what the world assumed of him. He knew his reputation framed every interaction, every relationship, whether business or personal, as if the molded projections couldn't be escaped. Yet, here in front of him, Miss Wen did the impossible. In a single night, by doing something as seemingly straightforward as running, she had shredded every falsehood about herself. She looked freer, truer than Ji could ever recall feeling. The idea that Miss Wen's rebellion resonated with him would have come as a shock to the family members who haunted his board meetings like specters. Ji family traditions ran deep, tangled in decades of wealth and reputation crafted from careful maneuvers. Respectability came before joy, and appearances came before sincerity. Ji Li had been raised knowing this, but he had failed to swallow it. At 33, unmarried, with the weight of multiple generations of honor balanced on his shoulders, Ji's defiance was quieter than Miss Wen's, but no less real. He avoided arranged dates with strategic excuses, delayed the right marriage for one that might matter, and walked the fine line of rebellion by doing nothing at all. The problem was, even with his inert defiance, the world continued asking for explanations. His family had begun making louder requests, borderline demands, for him to marry within their circle. "It's for the benefit of the whole family," his mother had said, only weeks earlier during a rare dinner they shared. Her voice was calm, but firm, disallowing rebuttal. "Legacy is everything, Ji Li. Don't waste that with small rebellions." G had nodded at the time, offering no hint of the fatigue and growing disinterest churning beneath his composed surface. Each demand chipped away at him, no larger than drops of water, yet capable of forming cracks over time. As the key mansion grew smaller, in his rearview mirror, G wondered if his life truly balanced on the precarious pedestal society had built for it. Was there more? Could someone standing in defiance, like Miss Wen, find a way toward something better? Or was this era of perfect appearances, polished but shallow partnerships, inescapable? From the corner of his eye, he noticed a figure far down the street. With hair mussed and her once flawless dress long since abandoned, it was unmistakably Miss Wen, though she now seemed to wear anonymity like a carefully selected outfit. Every aspect of her composure conveyed purpose, even in her hurried steps. G's car slowed reflexively, though he knew better than to interfere. The people who moved through his life usually had carefully detailed resumes and polished veneers. Miss Wen was a completely different strain of interesting, the kind that made even G hesitate to impose a simple narrative upon her. What he didn't know, or couldn't know, yet was that this wasn't just Miss Wen escaping. She was now stepping into a new identity, reshaping the way she'd engage the world, and inevitably, the way he'd see her. Her disguise wasn't just about concealing her whereabouts. It was an assertion, a brand new playing field, where control was hers, and hers alone. G let the car roll forward, not bothering to stop, not just yet. Still, he could admit a curiosity snapping within him, a unique collision brewing between her defiance and his detached observation. How would they cross paths not as orchestrated business connections, but as something entirely unplanned? He could already estimate the unpredictability Miss Wen had just invited into his orderly life, and while G rarely indulged whimsy, this moment challenged his restraint. Miss Wen didn't look back as she stepped briskly onto the streets of the city, now blending seamlessly with the ebb and flow of the evening urban crowd. Her gown, the defining mark of the life she had fled, was tucked inside an oversized satchel she had picked up while slipping through a discreet street stall just outside the mansion gates. In its place, she now wore a loose shirt that hung low enough to erase any trace of her original elegant silhouette, and a pair of faded slacks tied at the waist. A black newsboy cap hid her glossy hair, knotted hastily at the nape of her neck. For the first time, she moved without being watched, judged, or admired, a kind of freedom she hadn't expected to feel, rushing in so quickly. Her determination to stay ahead of whatever net her family's hired men might cast was evident in every step. The cash stolen from housekeeping funds helped her hail a cab without drawing suspicion, giving her enough distance from the estate's outer streets to lose any immediate followers. The anonymity she sought meant carefully crafting not just the way she looked, but how she moved. She'd observed before how men on the street navigated, sure-footed, shoulders angled forward with purpose, but without the careful gestures so ingrained in her upbringing. Adjusting her stride to mimic that was reflexive, a discipline honed from her martial arts lessons, which had always emphasized control over one's body and surroundings. Her transformation wasn't merely external, it was behavioral, a complete shedding of the identity she had left behind. Slipping into the stream of nightly citygoers, she began thinking not just about avoiding discovery, but also about survival. The name Miss Wen, with its family ties and upper-class implications, no longer suited her. Wen Ran, simple, common, was what she decided to go by, at least for now. With this name came a persona that had no ties to marble mansions or arranged marriages. It was the name of someone who could vanish into alleyways to find food at late-night diners, someone who worked odd jobs without anyone questioning her past. The challenge now wasn't just remaining hidden, but fully embracing this alternate identity. Every corner turned was a reminder of the precarious balance she had chosen to walk. If she hesitated or slipped, the family's staff prowling the city with a single photograph of her face would catch up. She had only seconds to adapt when passing people who glanced too long in her direction. When an auntie running a corner food stall offered soup with a side of prying questions, Wen Ran learned to deflect, spinning a simple tale about being new in town and looking for work. If even a fraction of her real identity were revealed, the walls of her new facade could crumble. Yet behind the layers of disguise, there was a strange comfort in the unknown, a place where social expectations no longer dictated her every breath. While Miss Wen navigated this newfound life, another name was making quiet waves. Li Tianyu, hired only weeks earlier by Mr. G as part of his updated security detail. Li's reputation preceded him, bolstered by an impressive resume littered with accolades that would intimidate even the most seasoned professionals. 5-year Special Forces veteran and National Free Men's Fighting Group champion were achievements most wouldn't argue against. His rigid discipline, earned in fields far removed from high-profile offices, now found its way to a more corporate order. People in Mr. G's circle thought him humorless to a fault, iconic in his dedication, but detached, a perfect reflection of the man who employed him. But Li Tianyu's professionalism faltered the moment his work brushed against Wen Ran. It wasn't due to any lapse in competence exactly, but because her transformation was so meticulously convincing that she slid past his scrutiny without a second thought. Li's sharp eyes, which were adept at detecting even the faintest threat or unspoken agenda, now overlooked the simple truth right under his nose, that the scruffy messenger boy casually delivering tea near Mr. G's car one evening wasn't a boy at all. Wen Ran, in disguise, had found her way into spaces she wouldn't dream of entering as a well-to-do heiress. The irony was almost too much to bear. The mighty bodyguard, so unyielding in his vigilance, saw nothing unusual in this inconspicuously dressed figure barely 5 feet away. It wasn't just Li's inability to spot the truth that lent humor to their interactions, but the way Wen Ran seemed almost to toy with her proximity to danger. In moments where sharp observations or casual questions from Li could have unraveled her, her own quick wit became her saving grace. When he demanded to know why she was hanging around the rooftop of the office building where Mr. G worked, she didn't falter. Instead, she shrugged and mumbled something about looking for spare bikes to fix up. Li's dismissive reply was almost a blessing. "Don't waste your time here. Nothing worth fixing around this place." For all his intensity, Li remained completely oblivious to being outwitted in the simplest way possible. These narrow escapes came with their own share of tension. The world Wen Ran had entered, the one of boardrooms, chauffeured cars, and guarded doors, wasn't a realm she could slip through without heightened risk. Every minor interaction tightened the threads of her double life, the likelihood of exposure never far from her mind. Yet, it was this very risk that added intrigue to her daily maneuvering. Each disguise she built wasn't just about avoiding recognition. It was an act of defiance against the rigid ideals that had once shaped her life. Wen Ran could be anyone, slip anywhere, and challenge structures that had once felt immovable. This moment of subversion also paved the way for small freedoms that had been unimaginable as Miss Wen. By disguising herself, she had access to a quiet corner booth in a budget diner where patrons drank soup without worrying about who sat adjacent, or more importantly, without glancing at her long enough to feel the need to behave. The transformation wasn't just about blending into the background. It provided Wen Ran a lens to see the world beyond her privilege. Where laughter felt less forced, conversations carried the weight of genuine struggles, and even the air seemed to vibrate with possibility. But the irony of such freedom was how precarious it remained, particularly as someone unknowingly dangerous began paying attention, not to Wen Ran for her supposed anonymity, but to the essence she carried beneath it. Mr. G, who had first noticed her through the glass of his car window, continued to intersect with her life in small but increasingly meaningful ways. Her guise, a rough, street-smart figure with little to her name, shifted their meetings into unexpected territory. He never viewed her through the lens of societal expectations, never sized her up for her family name, or treated her like the transaction the world would expect her to be. Something quiet and complex lingered in the air during their brief encounters. To Mr. G, these moments reflected pieces of a puzzle. Why this Wen Ran navigated the world with subtle defiance yet bore an unmistakable grace in how she carried herself. These weren't questions with answers he felt compelled to chase, but curiosity had a way of lingering like smoke, long after the fire had gone out. What neither of them knew, of course, was how entangled their stories would soon become. Wen Ran's disguise provided the literal barrier separating her from society's expectations, but it also created a uniquely fragile foundation, one where every meeting, every exchange, carried risk and consequence. How long could she sustain this charade before the truth would bring everything into collapse? Her freedom, her carefully guarded new identity, and whatever delicate thread seemed to form between her and Mr. G. The humor in her narrow escapes gave the story charm, yet there were hints of seriousness waiting beneath each escape route she carved. Her double life, while empowering in ways she couldn't yet voice, carried choices with costs awaiting to be tallied. Each mask she wore shielded her from one danger, but brought her yet closer to a different kind of exposure, the kind that might not threaten her freedom, but could cost her the raw connections she was slowly beginning to build. The streaked glass of the passenger side window distorted the scene just slightly, yet Mr. G barely blinked, his full attention locked onto what was unfolding on the other side. At first glance, it wasn't much to look at, just someone adjusting their reflection in the darkened display of a store window. But then he noticed the exaggerated twists of her face, the purposeful slouch in her shoulders, and the comically unflattering outfit she wore. It was as if she were trying to sabotage her presence in the most deliberate way possible. The figure he observed tugged awkwardly at her oversized pants, which bunched unflatteringly at the waist, and repositioned a shapeless jacket that sagged off her small frame. Her baseball cap was twisted sideways, as if it had been placed with the intention of looking ridiculous, and under the harsh streetlight, her face bore the unmistakable traces of smudged eyeliner, intentionally applied, like a child's unpracticed hand playing with old makeup. She squinted at her reflection, deliberately contorting her expression into something vaguely absurd, and then nodded to herself, satisfied with what she'd produced. Mr. G leaned back slightly, as if giving himself space to decipher this very peculiar scene. Among the many women he had encountered across carefully tailored banquets and social gatherings, all groomed to perfection and curated to meet expectations, this one stood out, but not because she presented herself beautifully. Quite the opposite. She seemed to reject every standard of the world they both came from, not by accident, but as a deliberate act of rebellion. For the first time in years, G felt himself watching someone without the lens of routine practicality filtering his view. Inside the world he lived, every interaction was layered with the artifice of wealth and calculated charm. The parties, the alliances, the arrangements, it all operated on appearances. From skyscraper office meetings to family gala dinners, where the slightest flaw in presentation could spark whispers, everything was polished to reflect an image. It was exhausting, repetitive, and stale, especially for a man whose own reputation had taken its fair share of hits. This display of chaos, this calculated disarray, ran sharply against the grain, and yet he found it difficult to look away. To an outsider's eye, she might have come across as unnoticeable, or worse, laughable. But G wasn't laughing, not in mockery at least. His lips curled faintly into a smirk, more rooted in curiosity than amusement. What was her angle? Why would anyone make themselves unattractive on purpose? The sheer boldness of it was enough to hold his attention. Deliberate, he thought again to himself. She wasn't clumsy or oblivious. She knew exactly what she was doing. What Mr. G didn't realize in that moment was that Miss Wen, behind her carefully applied disguise, was harboring just one goal: to be unrecognizable. She wasn't simply dressing down. She was crafting a character. Gone was the poised heiress, and in her place stood someone ordinary to the point of invisibility. Every detail of her look was chosen with intention, from the exaggeratedly bad eyeliner to the shapeless clothes that concealed her elegance. Perfection could be forgettable in its predictability, but imperfection, done deliberately, was almost like camouflage. Here, though, was the irony. The disguise that Miss Wen intended to make her blend into the background had done precisely the opposite for Mr. G. To a man used to polished sameness, her unorthodox presentation was practically an invitation to study her closer. In her effort to hide, she had drawn his gaze, not because she matched the traditional ideals of beauty, but because she broke away from them entirely. And this contradiction left its mark. G's life dealt heavily in polished veneers, the sort of facades that required no real effort to unravel, because everything always worked within the same framework. People wore masks for gain, for status, for protection, but nobody dared to wear one that made themselves appear less. It simply wasn't the done thing in elite circles, where advancement meant maintaining the proper image day and night. For a moment, leaning back in his sleek leather seat surrounded by the hushed hum of his car's engine, G realized how utterly bored he was of that world. Yet as much as her unique display intrigued him, he brushed off any notion that he cared to pursue an explanation. This was, after all, just a moment in passing, or so he told himself. She was undoubtedly someone with her own reasons for standing there on the dimly lit sidewalk, distorting her image so deliberately, but those reasons weren't his problem to solve. Yet, despite this logical dismissal, G's fingers paused, halfway toward his phone screen. For the first time that evening, not even his usual instinct to drown silent moments with work could interrupt the quiet pull of curiosity. The car moved forward slightly as his driver adjusted their position, bringing G closer to the scene. Observing through his sharp yet subtle gaze, G began noticing something else, beneath the humor of the situation, because let's face it, watching someone smear lipstick outside the lines was objectively ridiculous. There was authenticity. It wasn't the kind of authenticity he had to question or decode. It was raw, unfiltered, and intentional, in a way that shook the polished expectations of everything he knew. Was this what drew him in? The rejection of what was expected? He wasn't sure. G rarely entertained such introspective thoughts. But what stood out most to him was that curiously satisfying certainty Miss Wen carried despite her appearance. Even mimicking ugly, she couldn't fully hide her awareness, her finesse. She carried herself like it didn't matter who was watching, as if opinions, stares, or whispers had lost all power over her. That was what piqued his interest. It wasn't beauty, but the sheer defiance of caring whether or not she had any. In the world they lived in, authenticity was a fragile currency, harder to come by than any banknote. G had spent years surrounded by people who curated every moment of their lives, himself included. But this deliberate rejection of that overly meticulous obsession, it was almost reckless. Recklessly honest. Recklessly captivating. And it stayed with him longer than it should. What G didn't know then, sitting as an observer in the cloaked bubble of his luxury car's interior, was that this small yet striking moment would nudge a larger and far more complicated story into motion. With every second he kept watching, that spark of intrigue grew steadily stronger. It wasn't recognition that compelled him. He had no way of knowing just who she was or what she had left behind earlier that evening. But that anonymity somehow made her a mystery in a life where very few things actually perplexed him anymore. And so the dynamics shifted, if only slightly. Not because G knew Miss Wen, not even because he had any intention of chasing down this humorously untamed figure, now stomping down urban streets like she didn't care who saw her, but because this one moment, her half-braided failures of mismatched socks and makeup smudged like war paint, had left an impression. She had managed the impossible, to be noticed by someone who barely noticed anything anymore. This moment, her moment, challenged everything G had once thought unchangeable about how attraction, admiration, or even fascination worked in his world. He wasn't interested in perfection right now. He wasn't drawn to accomplishment or refinement. Instead, he sat back in his seat as the car finally rolled farther away, feeling a strange lightness that came from the realization he might have just witnessed a rejection of the very standards he spent his life navigating. There would, of course, be complications. If his fascination with Miss Wen grew, the gap between her disguise and her true identity would widen. G had no idea that the woman he observed that night would soon become both an answer and a new set of questions in his life. Without realizing it, his observation of her raw defiance had set the foundation for what many would call an unlikely admiration, an unfinished story that would tumble forward in unpredictable ways. Miss Wen was halfway through savoring her newfound independence when her phone buzzed violently in her pocket, shattering the quiet thrill of anonymity she had just begun to enjoy. She pulled it out hesitantly. A single message blinked back at her, heavy and unflinching in its simplicity. "Wen Tang, come home quickly. Your mom is sick." For a moment, the city seemed to blur around her, and all the defiance she had so carefully constructed, every step forward she had taken to distance herself from her family's demands, threatened to crumble. Her fingers tightened around the phone, as if bracing herself against the undertow of obligation pulling her back. She considered ignoring the message entirely, but the words lingered in her mind, echoing louder than her instincts to run further. Her mother, the one person in their tangled family web who had offered kindness, tempered by quiet endurance, was now unwell. And despite everything Miss Wen had endured, the manipulation, the expectations, the lack of respect for her choices, she couldn't ignore it. Hours later, when she arrived at her family's estate, the air seemed heavier than she remembered. The lavishness of the mansion was as stifling as ever, threatening to swallow her whole. The marble floors gleamed as usual, the grand staircase loomed imposingly, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and wealth. Yet, what had once been suffocating duty now seemed overshadowed by something darker. It didn't take long for Miss Wen to realize that her homecoming wasn't simply the result of a health scare. It was a carefully laid trap. Her father's voice boomed from the sitting room, cutting through the strained murmurs of the household staff. "Finally, she's here!" he exclaimed, his words tinged with the unmistakable edge of restrained anger. His sharp gaze found her as soon as she stepped forward. "Why did it take you so long to come back?" His tone was accusatory, impatient, as if she were a soldier reporting late to battle. Behind him stood her stepmother, ever the perfectionist strategist, with her arms folded neatly and her expression carefully composed. Miss Wen didn't rise to her father's accusations. Her silence was a shield she had grown adept at wielding. Instead, she turned to her stepmother, who finally broke the tension with a clipped, icy smile. "Your mother is resting," she said, each word dripping with a politeness that made Miss Wen uneasy. "She's stable for now, but stress is another matter entirely. Everything weighs on her, you know?" With a sweeping glance, her stepmother added pointedly, "Especially the uncertainty of your future." The words hung in the air, twisting like barbs. They weren't just a subtle rebuke. They were a warning, wrapped neatly in passive aggression. Miss Wen knew the subtext the moment those words left her stepmother's mouth. Her future, the engagement, the family's alliances, all of it was tied together in a suffocating knot of expectation. Her stepmother's gaze lingered for a fraction longer, calculating, before she turned and walked away, leaving the tension simmering in her absence. The truth unraveled within the next few days, though Miss Wen suspected it the moment she stepped through the door. Her stepmother's comment about stress had been more literal than she realized. The Key family's fortune, which had once seemed untouchable, was now on shaky ground. Recent investments had failed, and dwindling profits left the family's financial position precarious. Her father, no stranger to desperation masked as strategy, had latched onto the arranged marriage with a singular focus. It wasn't just a matter of tradition or appearances anymore. It was survival. "Wen Tang, you need to understand," her father began one afternoon, pacing the length of the study. His voice carried the authority of someone who expected obedience without question. "The arranged marriage with the Chung family isn't negotiable. Their connections can safeguard us from the fallout of recent losses. The Key Foundation depends on it." Miss Wen watched him carefully, her emotions controlled but fraught just beneath the surface. Her father rarely used her given name. The shift seemed deliberate, meant to tug desperately at what was left of her sense of loyalty. "It's not just about us," he pressed on, "but your mother. Everything we've worked for, her life's comforts, her stability, rests on this. The mention of her mother sharpened the sting, but it wasn't enough to break her resolve. Anger swelled in her chest, along with something deeper. Hurt, perhaps. Did they truly not understand how much they had already taken from her? Did they see her as anything more than the pawn her stepmother clearly believed her to be? She noticed the way financial phrases slipped into every mention of her, as if she were an asset to be negotiated. What about her happiness? Her choice? These were questions that hung in the air unanswered. In quieter moments, she visited her mother's bedside, unsure of what to expect. The usual warmth in her mother's eyes had been dimmed by fatigue, yet even in illness, there was a softness in her words that struck a chord deeper than any bargain or expectation voiced by her father. Her mother didn't mention the engagement directly, though Miss Wen could feel the unspoken weight of it in the pauses between their brief exchanges. "You've always been strong," her mother said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. But sometimes, strength is channeling that for others. Miss Wen had heard many lectures about duty in her lifetime, but this one stung differently. Strength, duty. These were the values instilled in her since childhood, yet now she struggled to reconcile them with a future she didn't want. The pressure was relentless, and for the first time in days, she felt tears burning at the edge of her resolve. The tension between her personal desires and her familial obligations was unbearable. Her stepmother, as expected, remained an ever-present thorn in her side. Subtle digs about loyalty and sacrifice peppered their conversations. "You're not a child anymore, Wentong," she had said during one particularly charged dinner. "We make sacrifices for the family when it's called for. That's just how it's always been." The words came with a deliberate finality, as though resistance was futile. But Miss Wen bristled. Though subtle as it was, her stepmother's absence of care for what she might want, what she might dream of, left no room for compromise. Yet Miss Wen's defiance was never far from the surface. Quietly, she began to consider alternatives. If this engagement were truly about finances, then perhaps a solution could be found before the final noose tightened around her future. The thought formed on restless nights as she stared at the gilded ceilings of her childhood bedroom, considering what lay beyond the confines of her family's crumbling empire. Her resolve grew with every passing day. She couldn't be the bargain chip they expected her to be. Not like this. And then there was Mr. G, operating on the periphery of their world, yet somehow closer than ever. As fate would have it, his business dealings intertwined quietly with her family's, and she noticed his name slipping into conversations between her father and his colleagues. Though she tried to dismiss it, a flicker of curiosity lingered. He seemed like the man least likely to subject himself to these power plays, yet somehow they all spoke of him with the same mix of fascination and resentment. What she didn't yet know was how pivotal his presence would become. The strained alliances and shifting fortunes within her family's network created openings for people like Mr. G, whose carefully misjudged reputation made him an unpredictable, yet invaluable player in the social hierarchy. To her family, he represented an asset no one could quite tame. To her, though still at a distance, he might be something else entirely, a reminder of the freedom she sought but hadn't yet found. But there were greater challenges on the horizon. Su Ning, a figure shadowed by her jealousy toward Miss Wen, came into play with subtle but cutting precision. Her pointed remarks and calculated actions added another layer of conflict to an already strained household. It became clear in their brief encounters that Su Ning saw Miss Wen's rebellion as cause for hostility, not admiration. There was something venomous beneath her polite exterior, something brewing that Miss Wen was only beginning to grasp. With the weight of conflicting obligations, mounting jealousy, and the ever-present specter of societal expectations, Miss Wen found herself standing at another crossroad. The stakes had risen far beyond her initial defiance during the engagement party. Now, her choices were steeped in consequences that extended to every member of her family, whether she liked it or not. Su Ning wasn't used to being overlooked, especially not by someone like Mr. G. In her world, men with his kind of power and reputation were supposed to notice her, celebrate her, even. Everything about her exuded control and confidence. Her immaculate style, her perfect manners, her family name. She had spent years cultivating an image that turned heads in every ballroom and boardroom she entered. Yet somehow, in the moments that mattered most, his gaze always seemed to drift elsewhere. At first, she didn't understand why. Ji was polite enough when they spoke and showed no outward signs of dislike. But there was an undeniable distance. He treated her like a name on an endless guest list, acknowledged in passing, but given no real thought. When she saw him look at Wenran, however, something shifted. His demeanor softened, his sharp features lost their edge, and his famed aloofness seemed to fall away. It wasn't outright affection, but it was unmistakable interest. Su Ning had watched him for long enough to recognize the difference. This was the start of something real, and it ignited a quiet fury she couldn't ignore. Seeing Wenran in her unassuming disguise only added insult to injury. Su Ning couldn't fathom why someone like Ji, a man for whom ambition was second nature, would be drawn to such a plain, insignificant figure. Wenran didn't fit into their world. She didn't shine the way Su Ning did. In her eyes, Wenran was the embodiment of mediocrity, a shadow creeping into spaces reserved for brilliance. But Su Ning quickly realized that Wenran's modest appearance wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon, and one far more dangerous than she expected. The revelation came during a casual lunch meeting where Su Ning overheard whispers about Mr. G's growing interest in a mysterious assistant. His connections never missed an opportunity to dissect rumors, and while most details were vague, one phrase cut through every layer of hearsay with precision. "There's something refreshing about her." That word, refreshing, felt like a slap in the face. It was the same sentiment that Su Ning had heard Ji express at a networking dinner just weeks earlier, though at the time, he hadn't been speaking about anyone in particular. The realization struck her like a lightning bolt. Wenran wasn't just anyone. She was her. She was the woman on the other side of his careful remarks and passing glances, and she had to be stopped. Su Ning didn't hesitate. Her first move was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. She approached her father, one of the business partners in Mr. G's inner circle, and began weaving seeds of doubt about Mr. G's decision-making process. "A man like G needs to be careful," she said one evening over dinner, her tone casual, but her words pointed. "He's brilliant, of course, but even brilliance can falter if the wrong people slip into his orbit." Her father didn't probe further, but she could tell her comment lingered. It was only a matter of time before the sentiment trickled down, and eventually, toward Wenran. But that wasn't enough for Su Ning. She wanted Wenran erased from the equation entirely, and she knew that subtle whispers wouldn't accomplish that alone. So, she took matters into her own hands. With the help of a well-timed phone call, Su Ning reached out to the HR manager at Mr. G's company, planting the notion that someone in the lower ranks, an assistant, perhaps, might be stirring unnecessary distraction, that someone, she hinted, was likely playing a role far beyond her station. The HR manager, eager to prove his loyalty to the higher-ups, promised to look into the matter immediately. The next day, Wenran found herself summoned to a meeting she hadn't anticipated. The HR manager, visibly uneasy, began peppering her with questions about her work history and credentials. There was a clear subtext to his words, a suspicion that she couldn't quite place, but felt closing in on her, like a tightening rope. Fortunately, Wenran's quick thinking and well-prepared cover story proved to be enough for the time being. She walked out of the meeting unscathed, but she knew this was only the beginning. Someone wanted her gone, and they weren't being subtle about it. As the days unfolded, Su Ning's schemes grew bolder. She began orchestrating small confrontations meant to rattle Wenran's confidence. Once, she intentionally spilled coffee near her desk and loudly insisted on an apology for an accident that hadn't been Wenran's fault. Another time, she arranged for a misleading email to be sent from Wenran's account, causing confusion about a meeting that Wenran had no part in scheduling. Each incident seemed minor on the surface, but together, they created an environment designed to isolate and undermine her. But Wenran was far from defenseless. Every attempt Su Ning made to destabilize her was met with quiet resilience. When the coffee incident sparked whispers, Wenran diffused the tension with a light-hearted remark that left the room laughing at Su Ning's dramatics rather than focusing on the mess. When the email debacle came to light, Wenran calmly provided timestamps and evidence to clear her name, leaving Suning with nothing to capitalize on. What Suning hadn't accounted for was Wenran's ability to adapt, to outmaneuver her at every turn, with a blend of wit and composure that only added to her allure. Despite her mounting frustrations, Suning refused to back down. In her mind, Wenran was still a temporary obstacle, a smudge on the glass of her otherwise pristine world. But as her schemes grew more desperate, they began to reveal something much deeper, a crack in Suning's own armor. For someone so devoted to maintaining an image of perfection, her jealousy and ambition were beginning to show. She wasn't just fighting to keep Mr. G's attention, she was fighting to maintain the version of herself she had spent years constructing. And with every failure to undermine Wenran, that version of herself felt more fragile. The tension between the two women escalated, creating an atmosphere charged with unspoken conflict. Even Mr. G noticed the shift. While he was no stranger to the subtle power struggles of his social circle, this rivalry carried a different weight. There was something about Wenran's calm defiance and Suning's increasingly irrational behavior that made him pause. He began observing more closely, piecing together the dynamics of a battle he had been pulled into unwillingly. Unbeknownst to Suning, Mr. G's growing awareness of the situation was tilting the scales in Wenran's favor. The more he saw of Suning's schemes, the less he admired the woman he had once considered a potential match. Meanwhile, Wenran, without even trying, continued to draw him in with her unassuming strength. It wasn't just that she rose above the challenges Suning threw her way. It was the way she did it, with a quiet confidence that never demanded attention, yet commanded respect. As the rivalry reached a boiling point, it became clear that a confrontation was inevitable. The question wasn't if, but when, and under what circumstances. Perhaps it would occur in one of the many formal events where decorum reigned, or perhaps it would be far messier and more public. But the collision of their opposing forces was bound to leave a lasting impact. The conference room buzzed with muted conversations, the kind of anticipatory din that hangs in the air before a significant announcement. Rows of journalists armed with cameras and notepads filled the space, their eyes hunting for the story beneath the carefully constructed surface. At the center of it all stood Ji Li, composed and unyielding as always, an image of precision in a freshly tailored suit. Behind him, the gilded G Group logo loomed, casting its shadow over every corner of the room. This wasn't just any press conference. Ji Li was about to publicly declare himself the heir of the G family empire, a move as audacious as it was inevitable. But beneath his calm exterior, the room felt more volatile than any boardroom he'd ever entered. He scanned the crowd briefly, his sharp eyes betraying nothing. Every step of this announcement had been calculated, every word prepared to solidify his position. Ji Li had built his reputation on operating outside straightforward traditions. Though his father, the elder Ji, was still nominally in charge, tensions within the family had been simmering for years. Ji Li's rise hadn't been guaranteed. Rather, it had been earned through grit and decisions that often ran counter to expectation. Now, the press conference felt like the final step in cementing himself as the undeniable successor, a declaration not just to the G family, but to every stakeholder watching. The elder G sat to the side, only partially visible, his expression unreadable. He hadn't openly opposed Ji Li's claim, but his silence in private meetings spoke volumes. For him, power wasn't something you declared. It was something you wielded without acknowledgement. After all, the G Group's image had to remain untarnished, and any internal conflict could give competitors an edge. Ji Li's public declaration invited scrutiny, something the elder G loathed. Yet here they were, the younger G holding court, while the journalists leaned forward in their seats, ready to pounce on any morsel of drama. Ji Li's voice sliced through the low murmur of the room. Today marks a formal transition for the G Group. His tone was steady, commanding, filling the room without rising in volume. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the work of those who came before me and assure you that the future of this company is one of strength and innovation. Polished words, structurally perfect and designed to project control. Cameras clicked as the journalists eagerly captured his every movement. But just as Geely was preparing to conclude his remarks, the double doors at the back of the room swung open. The sound was subtle, a muted creak, yet it shifted the energy of the space like a sudden gust of wind. Heads turned, and the buzzing of whispers rippled through the crowd. Standing there, unbothered by the dozens of eyes falling on him, was a man no one had expected to see, Meng Ting. Without hesitation, Meng strode down the aisle, his relaxed yet self-assured demeanor almost mocking the formality of the event. His designer trench coat swayed slightly with each step, a deliberate choice that spoke to his understanding of how to command attention. Geely's expression tightened, the barest flicker of irritation crossing his face. He recognized Meng immediately. They moved within similar circles after all, though Meng carried a reputation of being more impulsive, more unpredictable. The last thing anyone wanted at an event centered on control. As Meng reached the front, he adjusted his posture, standing just off-center from where Geely still stood. There was no formality in his tone when he spoke. Instead, it carried a casual arrogance that only deepened the tension in the room. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice loud enough to silence the whispers, "there's something I think everyone here should know." Geely straightened, his fingers curling slightly as he clasped his hands before him. "Ting," he said, his tone clipped. "This is hardly the time." But Meng cut him off, a self-satisfied grin stretching across his face. "I disagree," Meng said, his eyes sweeping over the audience. "In fact, this seems like the perfect time. Transparency is important, isn't it?" The atmosphere crackled as the audience leaned in, hanging on Meng's every word. Geely didn't move, but there was a dangerous stillness in his posture, one that only someone paying close attention would notice. And then Meng said it, the sentence that sent shockwaves through the room. "I'm here because I want to address someone in particular, Wen Ran, or, as most of you might not know her, Miss Wen, my fiancée." The room erupted. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled to catch this unexpected twist, and a low hum of gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire. Geely didn't react outwardly, but his mind raced. The name hit like a stone against still water, breaking the carefully maintained surface of control he had built. Wen Ran. Miss Wen. There was no mistaking it. That was the same woman who had continually lingered at the edges of his thoughts. From the back of the room, Suning watched with narrowed eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. This was chaos, the kind of public unraveling no one in their world could afford. Yet it wasn't the revelation of Wen Ran's name that soured her mood. It was the unmistakable flicker of recognition she saw in Geely's expression. Meng Ting, unrelenting, continued without missing a beat. "She's here, isn't she?" He turned, scanning the crowd. "She's been hiding in plain sight, weaving herself into lives her family wouldn't approve of. And now it's all spilling out. Isn't that right, Miss Wen?" The elder G, sitting to the side, finally shifted, his brow furrowed, his disapproval visible now, and for the first time, Geely could sense the weight of his father's judgment bearing down on him. But Geely ignored it. Instead, he focused on Meng, his voice suddenly sharper. "That's enough." Meng tilted his head, feigning innocence, as his grin widened. "Enough, Geely? You of all people should know this isn't the sort of thing you leave unresolved." The chaos in the room continued to rise, and for a moment, it felt as though Meng had successfully stolen the spotlight. But Geely, ever perceptive, noticed something Meng hadn't accounted for. Silence from Wen Ran. She was here, he realized, and she still hadn't spoken up. The audience's attention was spread wide, but Geely's focus narrowed like a locked compass. Meanwhile, hidden among the crowd, Wen Ran sat frozen. The weight of Meng Ting's words felt unbearable, pressing against her chest like a collapsing wall. She hadn't anticipated this. Not his appearance, not his bold claim, not the sudden exposure of her identity. She understood Meng's motives clearly now. This wasn't about rekindling a past connection. It was vengeance, a way to humiliate her for breaking free from the constraints of their family's arrangement. But there was something Meng hadn't counted on. Wen Ran wasn't the same person she had been months ago. While her disguise was now an open secret and her anonymity shattered, her resolve remained. If this was the hill Meng chose to fight on, she wouldn't retreat. She gripped the armrests of her chair tightly, her mind sharpening in real time as plans of retort and escape intertwined. For Ji Li, however, this event revealed far more than Meng likely intended. The press conference, once an arena for solidifying power, had descended into something far more dangerous and raw. The fragmented loyalties within the Ji family were now laid bare for the press to dissect. The precise veiled ambitions of the elder Ji clashed with Ji Li's open defiance, while Meng's intrusion served as a catalyst that weakened the unity they so desperately projected. Beyond the frantic energy of the press and the searing stares of his father, Ji Li's world narrowed further. Meng Ting's words hung in the air like smoke, obscuring everything but one clear truth. Wen Ran's presence wasn't just a threat to Meng Ting's ego. It was proof that Ji Li's perception of control had been incomplete. The humorless smirk he usually carried faded for just long enough to signal vulnerability, though he quickly masked it again with precise calculation. And yet, for all the chaos Meng had caused, his attempt to outmaneuver Wen Ran might have inadvertently strengthened her position. Ji Li, quiet but undistracted, felt something shift within himself. The public fallout of the press conference wasn't just about family power anymore. It was about protecting someone who, against all odds, had begun to matter far more than status or reputation. Miss Wen stood in the open courtyard of the Qi mansion, her posture stiff against the cold evening air. The familiar weight of its grandeur loomed behind her, every polished surface and grand column a remnant of the life she had always tried to escape. Tonight, however, the house, usually filled with rehearsed laughter and sprawling shadows of privilege, seemed quieter, as though it were holding its breath. And in the pooling orange glow of the lanterns, Mr. Ji stepped out from the silhouette of the gates, his approach measured and deliberate. They locked eyes, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Yet the silence carried the echoes of everything unspoken between them: his quiet frustration, her lingering guilt, and 1,000 unarticulated thoughts, all colliding at once. Ji Li's face was composed as always, but by now, Miss Wen had learned to read the shifts beneath his calm exterior. His knuckles flexed slightly at his sides, and his stance betrayed a tension he worked to suppress. He wasn't here for casual conversation. That much was clear. "You've made quite the impression," Ji finally said, his voice low, steady, but laced with meaning that cut deeper than an accusation. "Though, I can't say it's been a painless one." A humorless laugh broke from her lips before she could stop it. "Painless?" she repeated, sarcasm creeping into her tone. "I didn't think I mattered enough to cause pain." Ji's jaw tightened at her words, but instead of responding to the jab, he stepped closer, closing the space between them. "You matter more than you think," he said, his voice softening for the first time. "It's everyone else who's been so quick to reduce you to a set of expectations, Miss Wen. But you already know that. You've fought hard to prove otherwise." She stared at him, caught off guard by the directness of his words. For months, she had felt unseen by her family, by the society that dictated her role, by the world that demanded she comply. But Ji's words struck at the heart of what she feared to admit. He had noticed her rebellion, her struggles, and her choices not as defiance, but as declarations of her worth. "And what are you really saying, Mr. Ji?" Her voice was firmer now, no longer tinged with the self-protective sharpness she had relied on before. "That you understand me? That you've watched from a distance and suddenly have it all figured out?" "No," he said simply. "What I'm saying is that maybe I understood you the moment you gave up being perfect. That's when you became real." Those words landed heavier than she expected. Miss Wen averted her gaze, looking instead at the far gates of the courtyard, as though searching for a retreat that no longer existed. Not here, not in this conversation. Gone was the disguise of roughened jackets and smudged eyeliner, and with it, the defense mechanism she'd worn through most of their encounters. Now, standing in front of him as her truest self, no mask to shield her, she felt exposed in the way that most frightened her. "Real doesn't solve anything," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of resignation. "Real doesn't pay the bills my family can't manage. It doesn't heal my mother, and it doesn't stop them from seeing me as an asset instead of a person." Ji Li closed the remaining distance between them in a single step, his presence both grounding and unsettling, all at once. He tilted his head slightly, studying her the way he always did, as if searching for the precise string of words that would break through her walls. "You're wrong," he said, his voice firm in its certainty. "Being real, the way you are, the way you've chosen to be, is exactly what solves everything. It's what makes people listen to you, respect you, and most importantly, it's what allowed someone like me to see you, not just as you've been framed by everything around you, but as you are." For the first time, her deflection faltered. She felt the fullness of his words pressing against her defenses. It wasn't the grand declaration she anticipated. It wasn't desperate or overplayed, but it was honest. And that tripped her up more than anything else. "And what about you?" she asked, finally meeting his gaze again. "What are you doing in all of this? Being real doesn't exactly fit into CEO handbooks or boardroom negotiations." G exhaled softly, a rare break from his usual composure. "You'd be surprised," he replied. "For someone who's spent most of his life pretending he didn't care what anyone thought, I've found that embracing who you are, flaws, mistakes, and all, is far better than living up to someone else's idea of perfection." She blinked, stunned by the vulnerability laced in his words. They didn't just reflect her struggle, but revealed pieces of his own. Ji Lee, detached and untouchable to the outside world, had known his own kind of confinement, a constant expectation to maintain control, to lead without cracking under pressure. And here he was, shattering the carefully curated image he had carried for years, with a sincerity that left her disarmed. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I don't know how to fix this. My family, this mess. I've tried so hard, and it feels like I'm still losing." "You're not losing," G said simply. "You're rethinking the game." The word surprised her. She hadn't expected reassurance, not like this. But coming from him, it felt less like hollow comfort, and more like something earned through mutual understanding. It wasn't pity he offered her, it was belief. As the tension eased, she felt a shift in herself, as well as between them. For the first time in months, the knot of expectation and self-doubt that seemed permanently lodged in her chest loosened just a little. And though the complexity of their circumstances hadn't changed, she felt something new, a clarity that hadn't been there before. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about reclaiming ownership of her life, her choices. "I can't change all of it," she said, breaking the silence that had lingered. "But I'm not going back to being who they want me to be." G's lips curved ever so slightly into one of those rare, understated smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes, but gave away more than he intended. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As the final threads of their unspoken feelings came together, Miss Wen realized the moment wasn't about dramatic confessions or sweeping gestures. It was about acknowledgement of who she was, who he was, and the strength they both carried in defying the paths they'd been told to follow. Her independence, the very thing she had fought so fiercely to preserve, wasn't something she'd given to him. Instead, they met as equals, each bearing the weight of their personal rebellions and finding something authentic in the other. G's heart, so long shielded by calculated indifference, had found its match in her quiet courage. And for Miss Wen, his unwavering presence stood as a reminder that resilience didn't have to be endured alone. The world around them hadn't shifted entirely. They both knew the conflicts with her family, his business, and Su Ning's lingering schemes weren't gone. But here, in the glow of the courtyard lanterns, they chose something real over perfect, a choice that felt like power in ways neither of them had fully understood before. Authenticity has a quiet power, one that cuts through the noise of expectations and reveals what truly matters. Miss Wen's courage to defy tradition and embrace her individuality exposes the beauty of being unapologetically oneself. Her journey reminds us that relationships thrive on honesty and mutual respect, not superficial appearances. Research shows that 70% of people value authenticity as the cornerstone of lasting love, a truth mirrored in Mr. G's admiration for Miss Wen's unfiltered spirit. Their story encourages us all to embrace our imperfections and seek genuine connections. If this resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.